Okay, this is the palette. On the bottom we have titanium white. Just above that, cadmium orange, cadmium yellow, yellow ochre, cadmium red, burnt sienna, burnt umber, raw umber, viridian green, sap green, ultramarine blue, and cerulean blue. Okay, so before we do the block in, we do have to sort of draw in our shapes. And what we're doing now is I'm looking at the photograph. Um, Usually when I'm painting landscapes, I try not to get too detailed at first. I find that if I use the pencil drawing and I got too much information, it would kind of slow me down because I would feel obligated to paint every little nook and cranny. So what I'm trying to do here is working in a way that I would work if I was outdoors working in plein air. Uh, Basically alla prima painting, which simply means direct painting. Um, what I'm doing here is just really taking in the big shapes, okay, the big forms. I'm breaking down my picture plane and into basically a long diagonal. I think in the composition in the photograph that we saw earlier, I think that's what I responded to in this composition was that big, strong diagonal bluff, basically. Now, this is Monhegan Island in Maine. This place was just amazing. If you ever get a chance to go to Maine, I would highly recommend taking a trip here. It's just filled with painters, artists, and people of like minds. It's just an amazing, magical place. And to get to this spot, we had to walk through a trail and find our. Actually, it opened up to this beautiful vista that we're seeing here. Okay, so now after my drawing is down, which we see the line in brown, um, I'm moving over now, adding some ultramarine blue to my raw umber wash. Now, that the line that you saw there, I didn't get a chance to tell you what that was. That's actually raw umber, and the medium that I'm using is liquid. Okay, so I think in the outline, I think I added that into the materials list for you guys. If you don't have the liquid, that's okay because by the time we meet for our next class, your painting should be dry. Try not to go too far into it. So basically what we're doing here, this block in, all right, it could also be called a wash-in because the painting is like semi-opaque, so it's not thick paint at this point. What we're trying to establish here is a basic light and dark uh, template, if you will, and just grabbing some of the shadow shapes, and you'll see that what happens is when I start to refine some of the shapes a little bit more, you'll see that I start working primarily in the shadows, right, to reestablish the bigger shapes. This bluff is mainly in shadow, but there's also some areas that are catching the light, and that's what I like about this picture, was just those little slivers of light coming through. As you can see, every once in a while, I'll grab my paper towel and start lifting up some of the paint. If, let's say, I go too dark in an area where it obviously needs to be lighter, at this stage, the painting and the paint surface is very pliable, so you can literally wipe out sections. If you don't like how you started, you could just take a rag with a little turpentine and really just erase the whole thing. I apologize, there's a little glare on top of that bluff. Now what I'm doing is I am massing in the sky color. Now the sky, I'm using my titanium white and the cerulean blue with a little bit of, actually it's probably getting a tiny bit of the raw umber in there as well. Uh, that's okay because the skies are not normally, like when you paint the sky and it looks blue in the photograph, think again. I've painted in my days when I did illustration where I had to accentuate the colors, and and then whenever I would go out and paint in plein air, the skies are never as blue as we think that they are. Okay, so there's always a little bit of atmosphere which could warm up those intense blues. So don't get caught up in going too blue. Always add a little bit. What I try to do is I'll add maybe a little bit of red, or if I have it on my palette, alizarin crimson. I don't have that on my palette today, but some complementary color to blue. It could be orange as well, but in a very, very small amount. Okay, so here now I'm still establishing some of the shadow shapes. It's still very vague, but you can start to see some of the areas coming about. And if you look at the palette, when I go in, I start to grab some of the yellows. Now it's not exactly in sync, but you can, at least you can see like the piles of colors that I'm using, so that when you reference, well, what is he doing now? Usually you can see what area I'm pulling from the palette. Basically, I really haven't, up until this point now, now I'm starting to delve into a little bit of yellow ochre. Haven't even touched the orange. I think I do that later on at the end of the painting. But basically, I'm just keeping those warms that are in the rocks that we'll see. Always keep referencing as you're watching this video. You guys should you will have a picture. If you don't have a picture, just kind of remember what you saw. I will definitely see if I can put a link to that photograph. If I can't, I'll just send it to you guys. Just send me an email and I will send you a picture. This canvas is, it's actually Raymar canvas. It is Belgian linen, oil primed, and the size is 12 by 12. I know it's an odd size, but sometimes I like doing square paintings. I find them challenging. They don't follow, the classical horizontal rectangular shape. Is there a benefit to? No, not really much of a benefit. I think it just makes an unusual shape. You have to be careful of your composition. This one, if you notice, it has sort of a yin-yang effect. The negative space sort of equals the positive shape. So in that respect, it kind of balances itself out. Now, as you can see, and this is something that I want to stress, the painting surface that I'm doing is extremely rough, and it's just the way it's painted. You can see texture, you can see brush strokes. This, when you're painting rocks, this is exactly what you want. You want to try to achieve some semblance of texture in the beginning stages of the painting. Now, why would you want that? Wouldn't you want to have something a little bit more refined and, broken up? Not necessarily, because as you paint, as you evolve, you will have to change the contour. So if you get too precise, that's why I said earlier, the reason why I don't use pencil to draw these things in is because whenever I do that, and I've done that before, I start getting too caught up in following the line. Okay, when you paint, you should have the painting evolve as a painting. So the only line that you saw was the beginning. It was actually done with this smaller brush, but it was done in a way that we were just getting placement. I wasn't measuring anything out as far as like each little rock and separation. I was still going for etching out, again, the big shapes to the small shapes. My instructor would always say generals to particulars, which was just another way of saying big to small, right? And that's what we're doing right now, is we're actually working in, now that we have the base, the big structures done, right? That's why we put down that wash before of the raw umber, ultramarine blue, and titanium white in that first big lay-in. That was just to cover the surface. It's to get rid of the white. And that's the most important thing too in painting. You know, we look at a white canvas and we shudder. It's like, oh no, I now have to fill this thing up. Well, the quicker you are in getting a tone down, that fear will subside, because once you have a tone down, then you can start working into the mix, as you can see here. And again, I'm not getting awfully detailed. I mean, yeah, every once in a while I get a little, picky with the brush and it starts to make smaller shapes, but that's okay. What I'm trying to do is I'm still refining the bigger shapes. So always look at that. Again, still, the color that I'm using now, it's burnt umber and the raw umber now. It's kind of like a mixture, because there's some areas that do get a little warm. But even if you don't have the raw umber, you could use burnt umber and ultramarine blue together. You just have to use a little bit more of the ultramarine blue. And you can see that I'm trying to retain some of that cool color that we saw earlier in the photograph. Again, as you watch this video, it would be good to have the picture. If you don't, wait till the picture comes, watch the video again. And this way you could sort of look at the picture, print it out, or look on it at another mobile device or something, and just keep cross-referencing it, okay? This video was actually about an hour and a half of live footage, and this is actually sped up about 4 times, which makes it about a quarter of its time. So we're talking now about 24 minutes with all the intros and stuff like that. Also, okay, so here, again, if you look at the photograph, you'll see that there are masses in the foreground that are a little darker. All right, I'm trying to establish depth in the painting. All right, so by adding in that shape, now, if you notice, I don't really stay in one spot too long. You kind of, this painting is, I think they call it working in the round. It's like, we just keep moving around, right? In order to get an interesting painting, or at least to get a little bit of life and energy to it, you want to keep moving the paint around. You want to keep going from place to place, looking at certain things, moving away, okay? Even though we're working small, this painting is only 12 inches by 12 inches, but even working as close as I am, even with the camera right in front of me, I have to back up once in a while to see the whole, okay? Always look at that. If you're concerned about the drawing and the proportions of the shapes, I would suggest using a mirror, looking at the picture and your painting at the same time. If you can get it side by side, that's great. How I'm working on this is that I have my 27-inch iMac right to the left of me, because I'm a right-handed painter. So I have it full screen. So it's close enough. It's not exactly working from life, but my picture's nice and bright. It's backlit, and I can see everything. I'm not at the mercy of my printout. So if you guys could work from another computer, a monitor, an iPad, that would be great. If you can't, print it out. Try to print it out as good as you can. I know, with the quarantine, it's kind of hard to just I think you can get it done at Staples. If you can't, just try to work on it from your computer screen. Um, when you get the email, open it up, put it in a preview program, and just paint it from there. I usually do a lot of my paintings that way, unless I get them enlarged. But if I get them enlarged, I do a lot of retouching, a lot of photo editing before I do that. So here again, this process is still massing in. Now you're probably wondering, why am I still using this little brush? Well, I'm using the little brush because, well, the painting is 12 inches by 12 inches. Another thing, I'm drawing too now, so I'm refining a little bit of the drawing as I'm going. So there are areas where if I used a larger brush, I might lose some of those shapes. So especially down in the foreground here, I got to get a little specific, but not not to a fault. Just enough where I can get some texture on the rocks, but also keep the contrast. As far as the color is concerned, there will be more color later on when we move into the final application of paint, which will be the next video. I'll probably start doing going over the whole thing exactly like I'm doing it now, but now adding more opaque paint, getting more texture into the paint, thicker paint. This painting was done using the liquid, which is a medium that expands the paint, but it also helps it dry a little bit quicker too. So my painting is bone dry right now. If I wanted to put an oil wash over everything and go in and paint, I can do it. But you guys don't necessarily need to. When you stop and we come back next week, your painting is definitely going to be dry. Don't use any like painting retarders like oil of cloves. Do not use anything like that, because you could run the risk of it not being thoroughly dry. So you want that base painting dry, so that when we come back in, we want to still keep this energy going, but we're going to add more thicker paint, okay? Definitely more into the light areas, but we'll still be working on those, the shadow shapes too. We can't negate them. There's a lot of stuff going on. If you look at the photograph, you'll see that there's some copper coloring happening in those rocks. So it's not just blue slate. There's a lot of stuff. There's some green. It looks like some algae growing in there, or moss. There's a lot of texture. That's why I love painting rocks. That's why I chose this picture. Plus, I just think it's just a serene, beautiful place. There were cormorants hanging out on that rock that's jutting out in the right in the middle of the painting. We'll probably put those guys in at the very end, after some of the painting is dry. Okay, now reestablishing the midtone. So now you can start seeing a little bit of depth is starting to happen a little bit more. Okay, keeping it painterly, right? This is a painting. We don't want to get too caught up in little details, and we're going to keep moving around. Now, I am fixated at this point at that area in the foreground, because I want to make sure that, as you can see, when the brush stays in one area a little too long, what I'm doing is I'm kind of looking at other areas to paint, and I'm putting more paint in that spot. The reason for that is that I'm looking as I'm painting, so I'm going from one spot to the next. And what I want to do too is I want to relate the darks, and I want to make sure that they're at the right value that they need to be, so that when we do paint the second layer, basically like the finish or the next preceding layer of paint, that we get enough of the contrast in, so that when we do start adding some more of the detail, that's why keeping your paint loose and brushy, it does two things. It creates texture so that when you paint over something, or you paint over these areas, and you're like, wow, that texture looks great. All I have to do is add a couple little highlights and I have a rock, right? So it facilitates the shape making, especially in when we're painting rocks or painting anything, trees, anything that has texture, like a repetitive texture. And then what it also does is it keeps the painting fresh, right? Keeps it moving. You don't get too caught up in the line. You're getting what we're doing right now is we're really painting just the form. We're painting the mass here, okay? And as you can see, even though I'm using the same little brush that I used when I actually drew everything, I'm using the side of the brush. You can see the way, like sometimes I'll hold the brush on the side. So a brush that has a point now has a side. Okay, so it's just the way that you manipulate your brush. If let's say you were out in the field and all of a sudden you realized you only had one brush in your box and you forgot to take the rest of them, you'd have to make do with whatever brush you had. So if it meant like working with the side of a brush or the quarter or a tip of the brush, whatever, you'd want to be able to kind of manipulate it and still do your painting. All right, so try not to get caught up in every little brush doing every little thing. When you're working at this stage, it's about just reacting to the shapes that are at hand. Okay, it's getting the mass in. That's first and foremost. It's just like even with portraiture. If you were going to do a portrait, you'd want to get the lights and darks, establish, if it's a 3/4 lighting situation, where your shadows are, where your halftones are. Well, we're kind of doing the same thing, but we want to establish some drama with the rocks, the contrasts, and that's what we're doing right now. Okay, we're finding these shapes and refining them. There's some more darks in here. I'm also looking at the shapes too. Now, in situations like this where you have, okay, well, let me stop. Here I'm using a palette knife and I'm trying to get some edge work in there. If let's say you have a hard edge and it's like, oh man, I just put like this big blob of paint over here and it's supposed to have a harder edge, just take your palette knife and drive it right across. It'll lift up the paint and you'll have your hard edge back. Okay, again, can't stress it more, especially with rocks. You're gonna have a lot of those edges. Try to do it with a brush as much as you can, but if you can't, remember that's another tool. Your palette knife at this stage is actually pulling the paint up. We'll be using smaller palette knives to get some little edge work in later on, and we're going to make this painting interesting as we go forward. We're almost at the end. We got about another minute or so. So here, I think I'm adding a little bit more of that color to the back. Now, notice what I did there. I kind of deadened that color of the water a little bit more. I just added a touch of raw umber. Okay, that's just going to neutralize my my blues. Okay, so here we go. What I'm going to do, the next picture you see will be this painting. Here it is, of the whole painting without the glare. Sorry about that, guys. All right, hope you enjoy this. Next week, we'll have another video of how we're laying on the paint and getting a little bit more opaque. So we have 2 more videos to come. And I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you guys this week and then next week. Okay, have a great day. Bye.